So yeah, I was just saying that in this class, fundamentally what we're going to be trying to do is explain ideas of faith and belief without taking anything on assumption, right? So Christians are often accused of, just reading the Bible and believing everything it says, and it's blind faith, doing what it says, and that's the end of it, right? So what we're actually going to do is we're going to examine reality and not really talk about the Bible much at all. Certainly not in the first half of the class. Because what we want to do is use the lens of mathematics and science and logic and reason and philosophy and come to the same kinds of conclusions that people have been doing for centuries in having very strong faith. I'm not just doing what the Bible tells them to do. And so one thing I want to make very clear right from the start is, I personally am very convinced that faith is very rational, completely rational in almost any way you look at it. And anyone who sort of disagrees, I would say, is actually being quite irrational. And we're going to actually see that sort of time and time again. So it's a bit of a bold claim, but I think we're going to find that it's true. And so one reason why I say that is if you have anything you're thinking, like this is something I've personally been wrestling with, or I've heard people say this, or like sometimes I'll watch like YouTube videos of former Christians or atheists or skeptics, and they'll have all kinds of things to say. If you encounter anything, please bring it up. Let me know and we'll go through it, because I'm literally convinced that there's nothing out there that can challenge the Christian faith once we're really going through it very rigorously. Okay, so I think we're going to see that. And I think that's amazing and fantastic, right? Praise God that we have this kind of faith, okay? And so we're going to see that sort of time and time again through the class. But first, let me just give you a little background about me and the class and sort of why I do this. So I've been a Christian basically since I was a little boy. My mom brought me to church, taught me the Bible. But interestingly, when I was going to go to university, so I wanted to become a video game developer, and that's what I do now. I make video games. Okay, so I was going to university, and my mom was a bit worried about me going to university, because she thought that if I go to university, I learn about math and science and philosophy, I'm going to lose my faith. So she was very concerned. But really, actually, the opposite happened. I went to university, and I learned about math and like this sort of deep understanding of truth that undergirds reality. And sorry, no, come on. Oh, yeah, find a seat here, or more chairs. Yeah. Go. Cool. So I started, learning, pursuing this degree in mathematics and learning about the sort of truth that undergirds reality. That almost every other discipline uses. Science uses math. Everything uses math to understand the world. And at the same time, I started attending a church very focused on Bible study. And I started looking at the world through a similar thing, like this idea of this truth that undergirds reality. And it wasn't math this time. It was like this metaphysical truth. But I realized, we can analyze the Bible. We can analyze reality. And these things actually go really well hand in hand. And so I started to really understand that we could understand faith and understand God rigorously, logically, intellectually. It wasn't just like, well, I read the Bible and that was the end of it, okay? And so the flip side of that coin, as I mentioned, so my job is making video games. And as part of that, I'm creating worlds, right? I'm creating intelligences. I'm creating imagery and sound and dialogue and characters and stories. And I started to realize, when people play my game, they learn something about me, right? They learn what I think is fun or funny, what I'm good at, or maybe what I'm bad at if they don't like the game, right? But they learn something of the creator. And I realized this is another way we analyze reality and understand something about God, right? We analyze the creation and we understand the creator. And so when we're looking at sort of this reality through, again, these rigorous lenses of mathematics or science or logic, or sort of on the flip side of this idea of like understanding purpose, understanding creation, understanding design and meaning, right? All these things lead us to understand who God is and who God made us to be, okay? And again, we can have a very strong understanding of all these kinds of things, even without looking at the Bible. Now, which isn't to discount the Bible, of course. But one of my favorite verses in the Bible is from Romans 1, where Paul says, from the beginning, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. But what Paul is saying is, right, ever since the beginning of the world, some things about God are so obvious in creation that people don't have excuse. Okay, we don't learn about Jesus without the Bible. We don't learn about some aspects of God and his plan, but some things we can know, right? Paul calls this, or we call this general revelation. And this is the kind of thing we're going to learn, right? That we can understand God and our world even without the Bible, which is necessary, right? It's not to discount it, but we can learn a lot without it. And I think this strengthens our argument to the skeptic or the, sort of the objector. Any questions about any of that kind of preamble right off the start? Okay. And again, if you have any questions, throughout, feel free to ask. Again, if there's anything you're wondering about, anything like you're like, well, I heard my friend said this and I didn't know how to answer him, please let me know, and we're going to go through it. So yes, as I mentioned, we're going to be sort of looking at our reality from the ground up, right? So we're not going to take anything on assumption. And so why do we do this? Well, there's a couple of reasons why we do this. One, we want to be able to intelligently explain our faith. Okay, so 1 Peter 3:15, right, says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect. Right, so this is sort of incumbent upon us actually as Christians, that if someone has questions, we should be able to answer them to the best ability that we can, right? And certainly, we see in the Bible that, the Holy Spirit giving us wisdom is sort of an indispensable part of this. But to the best of our ability, we should be able to explain the hope that we have. So I think the Bible basically tells us to do this kind of thing, right? And I think, God gave us minds, right? This is a distinct feature of humanity compared to every other creature, right? God gave us minds. I actually perceive it's actually a form of worship to God to use it to understand God, to appreciate, to worship God for the world He's given us, right? And the mind He's given us. So this is, I think, actually a way we worship God, right? We worship God through songs every Sunday, and but I think using our brains to pursue God, right, is a way of worship, and a way that something God gave us as humans uniquely amongst all the other creatures. Right? Let me give you another story of why we do this kind of thing. So one video game company I worked at, the very first day, my producer, and if you don't know what producer, if you've ever seen a movie, right, the credits are like executive producer and producer. It's like they're just kind of organizing things. Okay, they're kind of like managers. He took me out for a breakfast burrito on my first day of work, and he said, Ryan, my job as a producer is crutch removal. And he's like, this is what I mean by that, crutch removal. He said, people come to me with a problem. They say, I can't do my work. This guy's bugging me. This person's not giving me what I need. And he says, okay, let me fix that problem for you. I'm going to remove that crutch from you. Now you don't have that excuse anymore. So what's the problem? Well, but still this is happening. So we remove all these crutches, remove all these excuses. Now what's the problem? Oh, I guess nothing. Good. Go do your work. Okay. So he said, if you remove the crutches, remove the excuses, people are sort of confronted with, I guess I better just do the work then, right? They have nothing left to kind of hang their hat on in terms of excuse. This is kind of what this does. So people may have legitimate questions. Well, I don't know about how can I believe in God because of this, or what about that, or and you say, okay, let me remove these crutches for you, remove these excuses, and now what's left? Well, I don't know. Good, go read the Bible or something, right? Now that you can move them to the next step, right? So some people do have actual problems, crutches, excuses, and our ability to remove them for them is fantastic, right? We can help them along their way, and they probably wouldn't be like, well, you answered this like logical conundrum I had, therefore I guess Jesus rose from the dead, right? But again, it's just getting them one step closer. Maybe they would actually read the Bible with an open mind when they realize, oh, actually it is intellectual, okay? And one thing we're going to kind of go over in this particular class this morning is this idea that people have that faith is irrational. Okay, this is going to come up a lot because this is sort of often a big stumbling block. We're going to get to that in a second. There's a quote. If you ever have remembered there's a mathematician named Blaise Pascal. Okay, he's a Christian mathematician, theologian, and this is what he said about religion. He said, people despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. The cure for this is to first show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good people wish it were true, and then show them that it is. Okay, so this is Pascal's way of saying, people say faith is irrational. Okay, so the first step is we need to show them that faith is not irrational. Because what they may say is, well, why would I listen to anything you have to say? Because faith is irrational. Anything you say is irrational. God is irrational. So every word out of your mouth is crazy. Okay, so this is a very, very blunt and bold statement, but it's sometimes the problem you get right off the bat is people don't even want to listen to you because they think that everything you believe is irrational. Okay, but putting aside these ideas of sort of, mathematics and rationality, let me give you a personal example, okay? So about 10 years ago, my mom very suddenly fell into a coma and passed away very quickly. And I'll tell you, when I was sitting in the, emergency room, the ICU, I did not feel like God loved me. I did not feel like God existed. Okay? But the, problem, quote unquote, the problem was I had too many intellectual reasons to believe. Okay, so I couldn't just say, well, look, this is a horrible tragedy, and therefore I guess God doesn't exist. I would have also had to like unwind all of my mathematical arguments, my logical arguments, my philosophy, my science, and say, I guess I don't believe in math and science and philosophy and logic anymore either because of this tragedy, right? And some people actually do that, basically, right? They say, in light of this tragedy, if this person died, how could God let this child die or something this effect? And they say, therefore, I can't believe anymore. But when we have these kinds of arguments, it actually helps us sort of weather the ups and downs, right? This is sort of similar to maybe, Jesus' advice to build your house on the rock, right? Now, the storm comes, you are still standing, right? So my mom passed away. It was very sudden, very traumatic, but I could still weather that storm and say, but I know, I don't feel like God loves me. I know it. I have this intellectual foundation, and that sort of helped me, get through that. So, whether we're sharing our faith and trying to show that faith is rational, or even if we, sometimes need something to kind of weather the ups and downs of emotion, this kind of analysis can really help us in both these ways, I think. Okay, I'm going to jump into something that Pascal did. But before I do, again, any sort of just overall questions, queries, anything so far? No? All good? Okay. So yes, Blaise Pascal, I gave you that quote about why we want to show that faith is not contrary. Oh, I think we'll put, forgot to go through the slide. Yeah, positive excess pressure removal. Pascal's wager. Okay, that's what we're doing now. Pascal's wager. So this is an example of how Blaise Pascal wanted to show that faith is not irrational. Okay, and he used a branch of mathematics called decision theory. Okay, now I'll give you an example of what decision theory is. I'll just draw a little chart here. So decision theory is a branch of mathematics used when trying to understand how people, or even like artificial intelligence, okay, make decisions based on unknowns. Okay, which is most of how our decisions operate in life, right? We're not really sure how things are going to pan out, but we try to make the best decisions we can. Okay, so let's think of a very simple example. Let's imagine we're at home and we're watching Netflix and we're having a good time, but we're like, I could really go for a coffee. Right? Starbucks coffee would really hit the spot, but you don't know if it's open. And I guess you can't check Google. So you don't know if it's open. You think, I really love coffee. Should I go? Should I go or not? Well, let's see here. So we're going to have a little decision table here. So this is go. Okay. Yes. I'm trying to like not block the you guys view as much as I can here. But is it open? Well, we don't know. Is it open? Let's see here. Yes. No. Okay. So now a key thing about decision theory is, so this is our decision, right? We can make this decision, we go or not go. We don't know if it's open, so it involves an unknown, right? We don't know how the outcome is going to pan out. But another key thing is we need to assign a value to it so that we understand how much we get from it. So, I mean, we understand this a little bit with like money, right? If you have $5 bill in your hand, for example, this is worth $5 to you, right? But if you had a Starbucks coffee, well, how much is a Starbucks coffee worth to you? Well, it's not quite the same, right? And so there's a theory or an idea in economics called utility. Utility is just how much enjoyment you get out of it. And it's a personal thing because how much I enjoy coffee might be different from how much you enjoy it. Okay. So let's just say that if you decide to go and Starbucks is open, this is worth 100 utility for you. Now, 100 what? Well, it's not really a measure of anything. It's not 100, dollars, not 100, milliliters of a liquid. Like it's not a measurement. It's just a number that describes how much value you put to it. And it only has value in comparison to other numbers. So for example, if you don't go, well, you get to stay home, you watch Netflix, that's pretty good. Maybe that's 20. That's still pretty good. But we see now, so getting a Starbucks coffee is worth 5 times as much to you than watching Netflix. Okay, and again, these are personal numbers. Okay. But it shows that you really like that coffee. That's really good. Now, if you don't go to Starbucks, it doesn't really matter if it was open or closed because you didn't go. Either way, you sat on your couch, you watch Netflix. So that's 22. Now let's say that you decide to go, but it's closed. well, maybe this was a negative experience for you. You had to walk a long way. It was raining. So we'll say this is -20. That was very bad. We didn't like that. And so now what, again, mathematicians and economists and computer scientists will do is they'll multiply. Oh, and then one last thing, we'll say, what are the odds of it being open? Well, just for ease, we'll say 50%, which as a decimal is just like 0.5. 0.5. Okay, so yeah, you don't know if it's open, but you're estimating the chance of it open is like 50-50. Okay. So what you do now is you multiply the value you get by the chance of that event occurring, and you get your sort of final number. So we'll say, if I go to Starbucks and it's open, I get 100, multiplied by the chance of that happening is 0.5, okay? Plus the other event, which is -20 times 0.5. And this gives us a total utility of 40. I'll explain this a bit more. Let me just kind of do this and, 20 times 0.5. Okay, plus 20 times 0.5 equals 20. Okay. So I know there's a lot of numbers and it's in a table here, what's going on, but I think this probably intuitively makes a little bit of sense, right? Like when we're thinking about what we should do, we think, okay, well, what is the outcome going to be? And what are the odds of that outcome occurring? Right? And that's kind of like, sort of how we make decisions. We don't usually use a whiteboard, probably, I'm assuming. But this kind of hopefully matches a bit of our intuition. This is sort of what we do, right? So if something is very valuable to us, we'll maybe decide to do that, even if the odds are a little bit low, because the chance of it happening, if it happens, that's fantastic. If it's not really worth that much to us, well, I mean, if the odds would have to be pretty high then. It's not going to risk a lot on something that's not really that valuable to us, right? So hopefully does this make some degree of sense? Yeah, okay. So we see that after we did our calculation, this result is 40, and this is 20, which means, according to decision theory, you should always go. Whether you don't know if it's open or not, right? But over time, if you go enough, you will accrue a higher value out of it over time, over enough times you go. Because any one time, obviously, it's open or not, right? But over time, you'll get the higher value. And so, yeah, this is just very, very straightforward. Decision theory used every day by mathematicians, economists, computer scientists. Okay, so this is just very, very straightforward, applicable stuff, practical stuff. People use this all day, every day. Let's take a little bit different example. Let's think about if we want to buy a lottery ticket. Okay, so it'd be very similar. We say not go, but should we buy? And of course, the unknown is not whether it's open. It's, well, do we win? Right. Now, let us say that the lottery ticket costs $1. Just to make it nice and easy here. So if we buy and we don't win, we lost $1, -1. Okay, let's just say $1, one utility. Let's say the lottery is worth $5 million. Pretty good. Okay, so we get a lot of utility out of that one. Okay, well, that's pretty good. If we don't buy, well, nothing's changed, right? We didn't spend any money, we didn't win anything, so presumably these are both 0. Now let's imagine, just again, make it simple, it's like a 50-50 draw. Okay, so everyone buys tickets, right? And if you get the winning ticket, you get half the winnings, right? So then the odds of winning would be 1 in 10 million. So that's like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, I think. Yeah, so yeah, that's right. Okay. So again, we do our little, analysis here, and what's the outcome? Well, it's 5 million times 1 in 10 million, minus 1 times. Oh, I guess this is like almost 1, right? In terms of how likely it is. Blah blah blah, whatever. You get the idea. So it's basically we're looking at negative 0.5 and 0. So over time, you might win the lottery once in a while. Maybe this is 50-50 draw. You might. But over time, you're going to lose money, right? And presumably this matches our intuition, right? Because the lottery company's got to make money, right? You're probably over time losing money. It's a bad investment. But we see that we can still do this kind of decision theory, even with big numbers. Okay, it's not just about Starbucks coffee. We can do it with millions and very tiny kind of chance. And so now we'll get to the point where Pascal just showed a bit about belief in God. Okay, it's going to look similar to like this lottery one. So we'll put not by, but believe. Should we believe in God? Yes or no? Well, let's see. The question is not, do we win? Does God exist? Okay. Does God exist? Yes or no? Do we believe? Yes or no? Okay. If God exists and we believe in God, what's our utility? Well, infinite, right? Because we are in the presence of the source of all goodness and joy and life for eternity. Sounds like infinite to me, right? The best you can get every moment for eternity. Perfect. If you choose not to believe in God and God exists, what's your utility? Well, it's the opposite, right? It's negative infinity. Because it's the absence of goodness and life and joy for eternity, or I guess it depends a little bit on if you think that you live in hell forever, which some Christians disagree with, but either way, essentially negative infinity. Now, if you believe in God and he doesn't exist, what's your utility? I don't know. It's, we're here this morning and we're having a nice day. The sun is shining. We're worshiping God. This looks pretty good, right? So yeah, maybe we'll say it's 100. We'll say it's as good as a Starbucks coffee. Okay, a lifetime of belief in God is worth Starbucks coffee. If you don't believe in God and he doesn't exist, well, maybe this is awesome, right? Because you're not beholden to God. You do whatever you want, right? You can do whatever you want with your money, your life. No one tells you what to do. Well, then maybe that's pretty. We'll say that's a million. Okay, so if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, that's pretty awesome. Now, what are the chances God exists? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you ask someone, is it possible God exists? You could ask them, is it possible? If someone is intellectually honest with you, they'll probably say, hopefully, yeah, it's possible, but it's so tiny, teeny, tiny possibility, like almost zero. You say, okay, fine. So we're going to give the skeptic overwhelming numerical odds here, okay? The chance that God exists, we'll say, is like 0.0000. I can write zeros on the board all day here. It's not going to change anything, okay? So, teeny, tiny. Chance that God not exist is, almost for sure. Okay. 9999, whatever. Okay, well, let's do our decision theory calculation again. So if you believe in God and he exists, you get, infinite utility times a teeny, tiny number. Well, if you remember your math, that's still infinite, right? Plus essentially 100. Well, again, infinite minus or plus 100 is still infinite. The expected utility here, regardless of outcome, is infinite. And very similarly, over here, negative infinity times teeny tiny number plus, a million is still negative infinity. Well, there you have it then, right? Belief in God is statistically optimal. Okay, even with teeny tiny odds. Now, did Pascal conclude, well, there you go, there you have it. Everyone should believe in God. If you don't, you're a fool. Well, not necessarily, but what he showed was, look, you can't say that faith is irrational. Because if faith is irrational, then decision theory is irrational. And mathematics and economics and computer scientists are all fools every day that we live. Because they're using a branch of mathematics that apparently is irrational. Okay, so this is now sort of the first example showing that anyone who claims faith is irrational is going to enter some problematic areas now, because all of these things that they would typically, right, according to the skeptic, sort of admire, right, math and science and reason, are going to be working against them every step of the way. We're going to see this kind of time and time again. But here's one example. Faith cannot be irrational, because according to decision theory, it is statistically optimal. Any questions about this one? Does it make some degree of sense? Yes? Okay. Let's see what we got next. Let's fly here. Okay, faith versus science. Okay. So someone may say that at this point, okay, fine. You got decision theory, I guess. So maybe faith isn't completely irrational, but I am more rational because I believe in science. And science is far more rational than faith, even with this whatever decision theory thing you've got here. So let's look at this a bit. So something strange has sort of crept into pop culture over the last century or so, that is sort of putting faith and science at odds. And this is a bit weird because, this is sort of a very recent idea. And it's not really reflective of reality today or history. So, for example, recently I was watching Larry King, and the guest was Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you're familiar with him, the famous astrophysicist, okay? And he was asked, are faith and science incompatible? And he said, well, 40% of research performing scientists claim a personal relationship with some deity. So in that sense, no, it's not incompatible because almost half of research performing scientists claim a personal relationship. Okay, now Neil deGrasse Tyson is not a Christian. Okay, so he's no reason to trump up the numbers here. But according to him, almost half of research performing scientists believe in some personal relationship with some deity figure. I mean, that's pretty profound and not really the kind of thing you would expect based on, again, this pop culture idea that faith and science are like bitter enemies, right? But let's think historically. Let's think back to the year 50 AD. Okay, 50 AD. So, Jesus is off the scene, right? He's been killed by the Roman authorities. The disciples are trying to spread the message. What scientific arguments do you think the disciples are using to convince people? Nothing. They have nothing, right? They've got no scientific arguments. They've got no mathematical arguments. They've got no philosophical arguments. All they have is just the message about Jesus. Now, fast forward 2,000 years. In the next two classes, we're going to go over 10 arguments for the existence of God in math and philosophy and science and logic that didn't exist when the disciples were around. So even from a historical perspective, it is certainly not the case that faith and science are opposed because science is strengthening the case for faith, not destroying it, right? Over time, we're getting more and more and more reasons. Even recently, one of the ones I've added recently to this class came from an article in Scientific American magazine. This is not a Christian publication, right? But atheist, skeptic scientists are basically doing the work for us because they're coming to understand something about reality that points to God. And thinking back to what I mentioned at the start of the class, my mom was scared. If I learned science, I would give it my faith. But if we think about it, this is a weird way to think, right? Because we're saying, God is so great. He made the universe and everything in it, but don't go study that universe, or then you'll lose your faith in God. Well, that's kind of weird, right? If God really made the universe, studying it should help us understand God. Like I mentioned about my games. People play my games, they understand something about me. They don't play my games, they're like, I think actually this was not made by any person. No, they understand something about the creator. So we should expect that if we study science, we will come to understand God. That's what we should expect, and it is what we see, right? And thinking back again, think historically. Many universities were created by Christians, okay? And it wasn't just like, well, they were Christian, that was just because of the culture of the day, and so then they built universities because they liked it, right? No, it was that, again, this is hard for our brain to even kind of understand because we're so far removed, but think back 2,000 years if you can. The scientific method didn't exist. People didn't even understand you could do science. This wasn't even something people understood, right? They thought the universe is just, in random and incomprehensible, and that's just the end of it. But some Christians started to think, you know what? We serve a God of order and intelligence, and I bet we can understand the reality that this God made. And they started to put that into practice, and they built universities and tried to do science, right? So it was their faith in God, faith in this understanding of God as order and intelligence that inspired them to build universities, create centers of higher learning. So again, it's not the case historically that faith and science have been opposed at all. This is a very, very new idea. And finally, when a lot of scientists are really digging into this idea of what can we know and can we understand, reality, one thing they come up against is a bit of a limit. So Albert Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? He felt it was bizarre. It didn't make any sense that we can actually understand the universe. Now, again, we kind of take this for granted, right? We think, well, of course we could do science. Of course we could do experiments. It's obvious, right? But, for literally centuries, it was very not obvious. And even to scientists today that are kind of plumbing the depths of this, it still remains non-obvious why this is true. Now, of course, we know why it's true because God made it true, right? That we can understand a universe of order. But from a purely naturalist worldview, it doesn't make much sense why you can understand the universe, why you can do science, okay? Let me give you another quote. So this is from a evolutionary biologist not a Christian, evolutionary biologist named Brett Weinstein. And he said, it's funny how often a scientist will tell me they actually do their work with zero faith, but not possible. Because how do you know, for example, that you are not stark raving mad, and that this room is on a fiction created by some part of your brain? If that were true, if the universe was something you couldn't observe because you were either comatose and this was just some kind of dream, or if you were the object of some kind of experiment where you were just a brain in a jar in a lab and people were piping in, information into your brain to do what you would do, then you can't do science, because the only thing you can perceive is what's being piped into your jar. So in order to do science, you have to make the assumption, right? I am real, this is real, I can run experiments on it, I can evaluate what I see. So what he's saying is, for anyone who says, well, I only believe in science, right? I don't have any faith, I only believe in science. What Brett Weinstein is saying, at bottom, you don't know you exist. You need to take even at least that on faith, because that much you can't show, right? And so one last example, there was again, Christian mathematician, philosopher named René Descartes. And if you know anything about René Descartes, you may know at least one thing he said, which was, I think, therefore I am, right? And what he was trying to understand was he was kind of looking at the universe similar to these guys and saying like, well, what can we really know? And for sure know. Because he said, what if, we think 2 + 2 is 4? What if it's 5? But we think it's 4 because a demon is like wiggling his fingers in our face and blurring the numbers, making it look weird. Okay, and we think, well, that's kind of weird, demon, I'm just finding a demon. But in philosophy, a demon is sort of this, just meaning like some interfering agent. Okay, something interfering with your ability to understand the world. And we might think, again, this is so weird. What are you talking about? But like, I wear glasses, right? Okay. If I don't wear my glasses, I cannot perceive the world correctly. Something is interfering with my ability to perceive the world. Someone who's colorblind sees red, thinks it's green. Something is interfering with their ability to perceive the world. And what René Descartes said is, okay, at least though I have thoughts in my head, I know I exist. Anything beyond that, I'm not really that sure if it's real or not. And what all these guys are sort of coming to conclude, right, is that it's not enough to just say, I do science, that's it, that's the end of it. Because at bottom, there are things you can't know scientifically. Okay. Any questions about any of that? All good. And so let's see the next slide here. Yeah, next slide. Scientism is sort of the name that's been given to this lately. And this is not just science. This is almost a sort of religion built out of science. Okay. Now, one thing I want to make very clear is I am not in any way anti-science. Okay. So I mentioned I do, video game development, but if I didn't do that, my second career choice was a quantum physicist. Okay. I love science. So this is in no way a bash on it. However, we have to have a proper understanding of what it is. And what science is not scientism. And what this says essentially is that, science will prove all true things, roughly stated, okay? And so the kind of line of thinking goes, well, we don't need faith, we don't need God, we don't need the Bible, because someday science will prove everything we need to know. Anything we don't know now, science will prove, so don't worry about it, okay? And this is sort of a counter to this idea that people call the God of the gaps. Okay, so what this is like, think again, thousands of years ago, people were like, well, I don't know what causes thunder, I guess it's God. I don't know what causes the sun to rise, I guess it's God. And then as our scientific understanding expanded, this, kind of room for God, these holes in our understanding closed. So this gap closed, and so this space for God closed. So the only reason why we believe in God, so goes this kind of God of the gaps idea, is there are gaps in our knowledge that we're just filling in with God. But one day, those gaps will all close by science, and we'll have no more need for God. Okay, it's called God of the gaps. So this is like very, often put forward by like Richard Dawkins, one of the atheists these days, right? God of the gaps. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can dismantle this, and we're going to see a lot of them today. First of all, this statement, science will prove all true things. Well, if this statement is true, then science would need to prove it, right? If science will prove all true things, then it should be able to prove if this statement is true or not. But science can't prove this statement, right? This statement is outside the domain of science. Right? There's no scientific method that will allow you to determine by science whether this is true or false. Okay. And so we see actually that the idea that science will lead you into all truth is very odd because science is not equipped to lead you into all truth. That's not the purpose of it. And part of the problem is that people don't really understand what it means for something to be true. And again, this might seem odd. Like, of course, we all know what something is true. It's true if it's true. What else is there? It's true if it's true, you know. But there's actually different levels of truth, and I'll show you what I mean. If I have a slide for this one.
What is the point of science? You're saying science is true.
Okay, yes, we're going to get to that. So we're going to start, yes. And again, not to bash science, but it does have a purpose, but it's not what a lot of people think it is. Okay, so these are sort of different levels of truth. Levels of truth. First of all, we have necessary truth. Okay. Now, this idea of necessary, is going to come up a lot in this class. So a necessary truth is something that is true and could not have ever been false, not in any configuration of the universe. So what are some examples of necessary truth? Well, some philosophers think numbers maybe are necessary, right? The idea, the concept of like two, you know, not the symbol, okay, not the word, but the idea, the concept of two would always be two in any version of the universe. So some philosophers think that. The only other example would be God, right? This idea of a being whose existence is necessary, right? You cannot gain any configuration of the universe without God, okay? So we're going to explain more about that in the class about the arguments for the existence of God, but we have this understanding of a type of truth which is so fundamental to the idea of reality that it just could never have been false. Okay, that's obviously a very, very high level of truth, okay? The next level is what I'm calling axiomatic. Okay, so for example, this would be mathematics. Now, in math, like in any sort of axiomatic system, at bottom, you have a couple rules that are sort of just assumed to be true. We call them the axioms. Okay, and upon these rules, all of math is built. And you might think an axiom is like, well, maybe it's like addition, right? That's pretty simple. But in fact, actually, addition is proven in math. Okay, the axioms are very, very simple. So at the very bottom, you have things you assume, and everything is built on top of it, right? But crucially, it's not built on observation. It's built on the rules, right? So no one is in a math lab performing math experiments, right? They're just at a desk with a pencil and a piece of paper, trying to utilize these rules to understand how reality operates, okay? And what this essentially means is that no one disputes a truth in mathematics, okay? So for science, someone will be like, well, I ran a study and this is what I concluded, but someone else says, well, I ran it and I didn't get that, or your study had flaws in it, it wasn't peer reviewed, okay? There's some argument and debate. That doesn't exist in mathematics or any axiomatic system, okay? Because once it's proven, I mean, someone can make an error in the proof, but once it's proven, there's no debate anymore. It's settled. So we see maybe, again, this is also a very high level of truth, okay? Because it doesn't require observation, it doesn't require experimentation, and it very cleanly explains completely what it's talking about. There's no missing details. Okay, now we're going to keep kind of going down our levels here. There's contingent truth. Now, contingency and necessity, or necessary and contingent, are opposite in a sense. Something is true necessarily if it could never have been false in any possible configuration of reality. Something is contingently true if it is true, but it could have been false. So an example of this is essentially all of history. Okay, so we are here today. That's true, but it needn't have been true. We can imagine a reality in which we are not here today, right? So this is true, but it's contingently true. It could have been false. Okay, and history is like that, right? Now we see maybe again we're getting away from sort of this very, very purity idea of truth, right? As we're going down our list here, this is true, but it sort of became true at a moment in time. Before that, it was sort of indeterminate, and it could have been false. Now, finally, we come to scientific truth. And it's a bit far down. But why is it? Well, first of all, we can see some contrast between it and some of these other ones. In contrast to mathematics, science requires experimentation. It requires these studies that need to be reproduced and redone and tested again. We find, we had some scientific idea, and then, we got a better microscope and we cracked open another particle. We were wrong. Oops, we got new technology. Okay. So we see that it's constantly advancing, correcting itself, refining itself, trying to re-explain things it thought were already, complete, but having trouble. There is a saying by the statistician George Box, and he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, so he's not a scientist, he's a statistician, right? So he's examining, demographics and populations and peoples and societies. And he said, all models are wrong. What does that mean? Well, say think of a map. You have a map and you're trying to get somewhere. Is a map true? Well, it's not true, right? It's not really showing you how reality is. It's just a useful model. It's not true, it's useful. And this is what science is. Science is not true in the sense that these things are true, but it is useful. So for example, the theory of gravity. Is the theory of gravity true? Well, it depends a lot on what you mean by gravity and a lot of what you mean by true, actually. Because when Isaac Newton came up with the theory of gravity, he thought that large objects attract smaller objects, and that's it. And that was very useful. We sent rockets to the moon. It's very useful. It had predictive power, but it wasn't true. We found out that that's not how it worked. And we thought, okay, that's wrong. Maybe there's a subatomic particle called a graviton. Maybe that's what causes gravity. Also wrong. The latest theory is Einstein's theory of relativity, that large objects warp the fabric of space-time, and this causes gravity. And maybe that's true, but you see, the truthfulness actually isn't the point. The point of science is a model of reality that has predictive power, that's useful in explaining reality. This is the whole point of it. And you see, maybe it's not really the same kind of truth, right? Because it's incomplete and it requires experimentation. We need a lab to try to do it. We need better technology to kind of keep going further, okay? So it can help us understand reality, but it's not true in the same sense where necessary truth could never have been false. Axiomatic truth cannot be refuted. Contingent truth sort of becomes true at a moment in time and then is true thereafter, no revision. Science is always in flux, okay? So again, this is not to diminish the value of it, the practical value of it, but to say this is not really striving for truth in the same way that some people, sort of up here are, right? Like when mathematicians talk about truth, they have a very, very different meaning of it than scientists would. And finally, the last one is just opinion, okay? Which is a truth that extends no further than your own brain. So again, it's true, right? In here, right? So Hawaiian pizza is the very best pizza. Well, that's true in my opinion, right? But it doesn't extend any further, beyond my brain. So we see that we're starting at a very powerful, broad, universal level of truth, and we're starting to sort of collapse what it means to be true. But you see, when you think of truth, if you really just kind of put this all into one, well, then you can start to come up with sort of problems saying well, science will lead us into all truth, But think about it. Will science show us all contingent truth? No, it can't. There's no scientific method that can do that. Will science lead us into all mathematic truth? No, in fact, it's the opposite. Science relies on math to do its work. It cannot show us mathematical truth. Will science show us all necessary truth? It can't. It doesn't work upwards, sort of in this hierarchy. So the idea that scientism will lead us into all truth is really misunderstanding what science is about and what truth is. Okay. Any questions about the levels of truth?
I just wanted to add something with the scientific.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was going to university, I had a professor actually say this to the class. There's no such thing as absolute truth in science, because science is always revising.
Okay.
So, and then one of my classmates said, but Dr. Fine, his name's Dr. Fine, aren't you espousing a truth about truth by saying that? And so, this talks about levels of truth, but where does absolute truth fit into that?
Yeah, okay. So I was actually just going to talk about that next, actually. That was a perfect segue. So absolute truth would essentially be necessary truth in this idea that it's a truth that is so fundamentally true that it could not have been false, right? And it's true universally and without exception. And again, I think people have, we're going to see this when we talk about the arguments for the existence of God in terms of, what is truth and what is morality? Because when people actually typically talk in absolute terms, usually they don't actually understand what they're saying. Because when the professor said there's no such thing as absolute truth, really what he was basically saying was like, if you're looking just down here, there's no such thing as absolute truth. Well, fine, yeah, I guess, right? Or if no such thing as absolute truth in terms of your opinion of things. But yeah, okay, that's not any, wonderful revelation. That's obvious, right? But the problem is if you don't understand what truth is, you're going to get into problems. So let's look at that example. So, another way of saying it is all truth is relative. Okay, this is sort of something that you may hear. All truth is relative. Or, one version of it these days is live your truth. You may hear that. All truth is relative. Now, kind of what you're saying, this statement, all truth is relative, is that true or not? Is that absolutely true or not? Well, if this statement is absolutely true, well, it just refuted itself. So we have an example of at least one truth statement that is absolutely true, this one. And if this truth statement is not absolutely true, if it's relative, well, then why should I believe it? It's true in your brain and not mine then. In my brain, it is absolutely true. Like, you see? So if this statement is relatively true, it's meaningless, right? If it's absolutely true, it's self-refuting. So this idea that, there's no such thing as absolute truth or all truth is relative is self-contradictory right on the face of it. And one thing we're going to find actually is, this is sort of what I mean about people don't really understand when they talk in these terms of absolute and truth, it's actually going to lead into either a contradiction or God every time, right? Because if you think of it, when you start to understand the ideas of this sort of universal truth, well, what is universal truth if not God, essentially, right? Like a rose by any other name smells as sweet, right? The only sort of destination of this universality of truth that could not be false, that is essentially synonymous with God, right? So we're going to see this kind of time and time again. Another way to think about this, so, for that, your professor there, even in science, right? Is gravity true for you and not for me, right? Or do we perceive that the laws of physics are absolutely true for all of us? Well, yeah, it's true for everyone, right? The laws of physics are not relatively true for you and me and you differently, right? When I go up, I float up and, like if you really think there's no such thing as absolute truth, you shouldn't leave your house because you might be pulled into space by gravity, right? But people don't actually believe this, right? They say it because they don't either understand what truth is or they just need that crutch, right? Because if you really believe there's no such thing as absolute truth, you should not ride a plane because who knows what happens then, right? Because the laws of physics might react to that plane differently than that plane or for you differently than another passenger, okay? But no one actually lives like this. And so C.S. Lewis, said that the naturalist worldview, the view that, the nature is all we have, he said this worldview is unlivable. And this is kind of what he means. It's not livable to go around saying that all truth is relative because you're not living that, right? When you go outside, you trust that gravity keeps you on the ground. You don't think it might just pull you into space, right? So anyone who espouses this view is actually living a self-contradictory life. They're not living life honestly. So like C.S. Lewis said, it's not livable. Any other sort of questions about, levels of truth or truth being relative?
Okay, most truth is relative.
I just want to keep beeping over here. Well, again, it depends maybe by what you mean by most, right? Like, I would say, the important truth, I would say, is absolute, right? It's, by the quantity of people and the quantity of their opinions, I suppose you could say the quantity, the percentage of things someone could say would be relatively true, because it's probably mostly down here, right? Just in terms of the number of statements that could be made. But certainly I'd say the important truths are, the ones up here typically, right? But yes, obviously the people can say a lot of things, but typically, come down here. But really, when someone says all truth is relative, really, what they're saying is like all opinion is relative, right? Because it collapsed all this truth into one. But it's when you kind of pull it apart that you see that this doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so one final way to refute scientism is called Gödel's incompleteness theorems. So Kurt Gödel was a mathematician, Christian, and a logician. He was a master of logic. That's a job, master of logic. And so one thing you may notice I've been saying a lot in the class so far is someone, being a mathematician or a scientist and also a Christian. And again, trying to underscore, again, this idea that faith and science and reason, these are not incompatible things. These amazing, brilliant people, Pascal, Descartes, Kurt Gödel is, if not the most well-regarded logician of all time, like top 3. So I'm sure no one's really heard of him, but in the world of mathematics and logic, he is held with just incomparable esteem, right? So the people doing these kinds of work are Christian, and this is not any kind of contradiction for them, right? This isn't any internal struggle. This really, their work is an outpouring of their faith. Okay, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So what Kurt Gödel proved in mathematics, he proved this mathematically. He proved that in any non-trivial system, there are things that are true, for sure true, that can never be proven. Are true that can never be proven. Never be proven. Are true, never be proven. I mean, it's hard for us to even imagine. There is a mathematical proof of this, okay, which is really bizarre. Let's think of this a second. Okay, what is even non-trivial? Okay, let's imagine the universe of the color of my marker. Okay, well, that's black, and then we're done. Okay, this is a very trivial system. But our universe is a non-trivial system. Mathematics is a non-trivial system, right? So there are things in mathematics that are true that no mathematical proof will ever be able to demonstrate. They are true, for sure they're true. We just cannot prove it. And same in science. There are things in our universe, in our reality, that are scientifically true, for sure, that can never be proven. So now let's think back to scientism. In scientism, science will lead us into all true things. I mean, no, it won't, right? There's a mathematical proof of this. And this is 100 years old. So it's not even that new, okay? But it shows very clear. Remember, mathematics is a very high level of truth in our thing there, right? So it shows that it is futile to think that any naturalist means will deliver us into all truth. Impossible. Mathematically shown impossible. Now remember, in mathematics, like in any axiomatic system, no one disputes this. There's not a mathematician or a logician alive that disbelieves this statement. They all know it's true. With no one is doing any work to disprove it. It's mathematically proven, right? Again, which is different from science, right? In science, people might try to do experiments, try to figure out, hey, what went wrong, No one disputes this. Now, you may think that maybe this is just some weird niche, theorem in the back of some logic textbook and not really practical. In fact, this comes up a lot, at least in the academic field that I sort of traffic in, I guess. But a year will never go by where I don't find an article where someone talking about how they're trying to determine limits of computation, right? The idea of like, well, we're making faster and faster computers. Are there problems we can never solve? And in fact, there are, and they show it by this, right? Recently, I was browsing the blog of Stephen Hawking, right? Very famous astrophysicist. And you might remember he was trying to come up with a theory of everything. They made a movie about it called The Theory of Everything. And on his blog, I wasn't even looking about this. I was looking at something else, but it happened to see this. He said he was giving up his search for the theory of everything because of these theorems. He realized it was impossible to come up with a theory of everything based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Now, it's 100 years old, so I'm not quite sure what took him so long to find it. But nevertheless, even Stephen Hawking, atheist scientist, looked at this and said, yeah, I guess we really can't come up with a scientism of theory of everything, okay? So again, even if you think I'm wrong, okay, you have to think that all mathematicians and logicians are wrong because they all believe it. Stephen Hawking believes it, right? So this is not some niche theorem. Like, this is everyday real mathematics. But it shows, I think, very conclusively, you cannot believe in scientism. So again, is faith irrational? Actually, no. The belief that you could explain all of reality without faith is irrational, as shown by, Godel's Incompleteness theorem, amongst other things. So again, what we're seeing time and time again, faith is not irrational. Faith is very rational. Whether you look at it through, mathematics, philosophy, logic, decision theory, every single time we come up with the understanding that we need faith to understand our reality. There are things we cannot show. And one thing I guess I'll mention too is, like, I was sort of mentioning about how a couple times now, how mathematicians don't dispute mathematics, right? There's no competing experiments being done. Okay, so Pascal's wager, decision theory, this is just well understood mathematics. This one as well. Okay. However, if you were to, for example, like, you're like, oh, Ryan, this is kind of interesting. Let me go Google. I'm gonna go home and Google Pascal's wager and what people think. You will find some people who dismiss Pascal's wager as any kind of reasonable way to understand reality. And the thing is, though, you won't find mathematicians saying that. You'll find people who don't understand math saying it, because they don't really understand it. That's just how math works. And we apply it to everything else in life, right? Again, economists, statisticians, computer scientists use it every day, right? So it can't be irrational. But they'll say things like, well, Pascal's wager is a bad reason to believe in God, right? That's a very stupid reason to say, well, I believe in God because of Pascal's wager. And to some degree, that's true, right? We don't say, like, I love God because of statistics, right? We probably don't say that, right? However, again, I think what this is missing is that the objections to faith in Christianity are often objections that don't make sense in any other context, right? But again, it's kind of this crutch. So for example, would someone say, I had 2 job offers and one of them paid me this and had a percentage chance of, like, getting a promotion, this percentage chance, I had these benefits. And so I weighed all this and I came to, like, the outcome that seemed best. No one would say, that's a very irrational reason to choose a job. They'll say, yeah, that makes sense. That's logic, right? Right? But that's the exact same decision process for what I went with Pascal's wager, you see? So the argument that it doesn't make sense, it's irrational, is perfectly rational in every other context. But somehow, when applied to ideas of faith in God, it just becomes irrational, right? So you'll see that come up time and time again. And for this one as well, I've had multiple friends, because I talk to my friends and tell them this, multiple friends who are not mathematicians tell me that I'm misunderstanding the use of this theorem. Okay, now, I'm not the world's greatest mathematician, okay? I'm not the world's greatest logician. I do have a degree in it, so I'm not that bad at it, hopefully, okay? But again, it's not just me, right? It's every mathematician, every logician, Stephen Hawking, right? But again, this is something else you'll get is, people who don't really know what they're talking about, making these kind of bold claims, like, well, you're just using the theorem wrong. Because one thing you'll find, I think, is when you start to, let me erase this here. Oh, sorry, does anyone have any questions about that? I guess as I'm erasing. There is a book. The book is called Tactics, and the author is Greg Koukl. And he's a Christian, and he wrote this book to give you tactics for sharing the Christian faith. And one thing he said was, if someone tells you something, ask them, oh, how did you come to that conclusion? And he said, most often they won't know, right? Because people tend to just either one or two things, just parrot what they've heard because it aligns with their existing beliefs, or they'll make bold statements because they're not left with any alternative. So for example, when I was, went through all this stuff, went through all this stuff with my friends, and they said, well, you're just using the theorem wrong. That was because they had nothing left, right? That's all they could say, because I went through everything so logically with them. Then what else could they say other than that's just not what the theorem means, right? They're just grasping at straws. Okay. So if you say to them, well, oh, you think this theorem is wrong. Well, how did you come to that conclusion? You don't have to say it maliciously, but just earnestly, And what he said was, most people don't know, and they won't have an answer. And so their realization of that fact will kind of do the work for you in a sense, right? So an example he gave was, he was on a flight and he was reading his Bible or something, and a Muslim was in the seat next to him, and he saw him reading his Bible and said, don't you know the Bible's full of errors? And so Greg Koch said, oh, interesting. Like what? And the Muslim was taken aback, and he said, no one has ever asked me that before. And he didn't know. He had nothing to say. Because he kept just parroting it, and no one had ever asked him, oh, how did you come to conclude that? You see? So I think most often people don't really know why they've come to conclude what they have. They just conclude it because it fits with what they want to believe. Okay, and it's just easy. Okay, so just ask, how did you come to that conclusion? I think will help you in a lot of cases. Okay, we're going to try to finish up somewhat soon here. Any questions about, I guess, what is the incompleteness theorem or tactics for sharing your faith? Okay. So let's see what I got here. Okay, yeah, objections to the rationality of faith. So what are some things people will say then? So they say faith is irrational. Well, what do they then say is rational? Well, let's think about this for a second. So what have we done over the last hour here? What I've tried to do is kind of clear the rubble, as it were, of a lot of this like confusion of what it even means to be true or rational, okay? And we're going to, again, build this foundation from the ground up of analyzing reality. So we've kind of cleared some of the miscommunication errors out of the way, and we're going to build this up. But so let's think about what some of these objections might be here. Objections. Okay. Well, to be 100% honest with you, I have not heard any good ones. If you encounter a good one, please let me know, because I would love to hear it. I'm constantly trying to find good objections, and I keep running into the same weird ones. Okay, so if you come up with a good one, please let me know. I would consider that a great favor. Number one, they believe in evolution. Okay, this is an objection. Well, I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in God because I believe in evolution. Now, we're not going to talk about evolution a lot in this class because actually it doesn't matter. Evolution is so irrelevant to the idea of God and faith that it's really unfortunate that it ever became this like flashpoint in the discussion. Because think of it, okay. What evolution is saying is that on this planet, this particular planet, billions of years after the universe was created, well, chemicals coalesced and made people, blah, 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 whatever. But my question is, well, how did the universe begin? Right? That's the question. The question is not what happened on this planet. The big question is, how did the universe begin? Was it God or not? And that's the crux of it, right? Because is it possible that God used evolution as a mechanism to make humanity? Well, sure. A lot of Christians do believe that. Fine. God's intelligent enough to, set up all the, things in motion and let it go. Fine. Okay. Is it possible God snapped his fingers and made, everything? Yeah. Also very possible. Okay. But the point of it is, though, that already was sort of determined by how the universe began, right? So evolution, any discussion of evolution on this planet is billions of years too late to matter to the big question of how did the universe begin, right? So the whole idea of looking at evolution is like sort of a red flag or red hair, false positive, whatever we call it, It just has nothing to do with the question, because that's what we want to know. Did God make the universe or not? That is the question. And the process of evolution that began billions of years after the universe began on one planet has nothing to say about the beginning of the universe. That is the question, okay? Similarly, someone will say, well, I don't believe in God because there's suffering, okay? So again, I watched a video, a guy who was the lead singer of a Christian worship band. I can't remember which one it was, but it was a pretty famous one that, toured the world. They released all kinds of records, okay? And he said he flew to Uganda and he saw suffering in Uganda. And he realized, how could God allow this suffering? I guess God doesn't exist. Okay. Now, the big question, again, I would ask, when anyone says to you, well, I observe this thing, whether this thing is suffering or evolution, is what are the cosmological implications of that conclusion? And the cosmological, so cosmology being like origin of the universe, right? The cosmological implications of suffering in Uganda are nothing, right? Because again, this is billions of years too late. Either God made the universe or he didn't. Now, suffering in Uganda may be an interesting question of like the nature of God, the plans of God, our relation between us and God, maybe, okay, is nothing to do about the existence of God. So, because think of what that would mean. That would mean that, okay, because I see suffering in Uganda, that means retroactively, billions of years ago, God didn't make the universe. But if somehow the course of history was such that there was no suffering in Uganda, I guess retroactively, yeah, God could have made the universe billions of years ago. No, cause and effect doesn't flow backward like that, right? Either God made the universe and then things proceeded, or he didn't. But looking at the reality now in year 2022 and deciding what we see means for the creation of the universe billions of years ago is looking at things backwards. Okay, that's not how things work. Okay, again, you could say, well, because there's suffering in Uganda, God is not loving. Okay, well, that's maybe an argument that we can have. But it cannot be God doesn't exist, because the universe already exists. It was made or it wasn't. Okay, any questions about these two? Let's see here. Another one they'll say is, well, Christianity can't be true because there are multiple religions. So no one of them can be true. And again, right, we don't use this kind of logic for anything else. We don't say, well, there are multiple choices on this test, therefore I refuse to fill in a bubble because they're all wrong. Or there are multiple political parties, therefore I refuse to vote because they're all wrong. Right? We don't use this logic for anything else. Sometimes, amongst all the options, one is true and the others are false, right? This is not a crazy thing for us to understand, but somehow, again, when it's applied to faith, it just, people rationalize it in a totally different way. So they'll use this logic for everything and say sometimes one thing is true. Oh, but not for this. So the objection being, well, there are Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindu and Buddhists who are all sincerely convinced of their belief. And it's impossible, therefore, that their sincere belief would lead them to an incorrect conclusion. That's essentially the argument. But again, even if that were true, even if somehow that were true, what are the cosmological implications of multiple religions existing on a planet billions of years after the universe was created? Nothing. God already either made the universe or he didn't. And billions of years later, when people emerged and started to adhere to one religion or another, is still billions of years too late to answer the question of what happened at the origin of the universe. Right? And that is the crux of it all. Because that's how everything kind of flows from that moment. Who made the universe? Or what, I guess, if you don't want to call it who, but that is the crux of it. And what we're going to find over the next two classes is we can actually analyze the nature of the being who created the universe and why it is, in fact, a personal being. Okay, and that's actually going to answer a lot of this for us. So we start to see maybe a lot of these objections, they just don't make any sense anymore. Because how can we look at our present reality and make an inference as to how the universe began based on, someone suffering or the fact that there are multiple religions in the world, right? Again, the universe already existed or it didn't. It was created or it wasn't. Any questions? This next slide here. Okay, yeah, one last final thing here. We're coming up close to the time of the service. So one thing we're going to look at in this class is a branch of mathematics called propositional logic. And it is a branch of mathematics that uses propositions, which is statements. Okay, but it's a very rigorous branch of mathematics that helps us to unpack and analyze arguments people make and to see if they're valid arguments or not. So, for example, someone will say, well, I don't believe in the Bible because there are miracles in the Bible. And miracles are against the laws of physics, right? Miracles are impossible. Therefore, the Bible's wrong. Okay. Well, let's unpack that a little bit. So in propositional logic, this would be something like, if the Bible is true, if B, then miracles are true. So you kind of use this symbolic notation. If the Bible's true, then miracles are true. Now, this is just an obvious truth, right? Christians or non-Christians can both admit this is true. If the Bible were true, then miracles would be true. Okay, that's fine, right? Even though atheists would say that. But of course, they claim that miracles are not true. In propositional logic, this is a symbol for not. They say, okay, if the Bible were true, then miracles would be true. Fine, fine. But miracles are not true. And there's a rule of propositional logic that says if you have something that looks like this, if one thing then the other, it's equally true to say that not this thing implies not that thing. So in this case, not and implies not. Now let me give you an example of what I mean by this. If we are all in the Ridge Church building, B for building, we are in the Ridge Church building, we are in Maple Ridge, M for Maple Ridge, right? Obvious. If we are not in Maple Ridge, well, it's very obvious we're not in the Ridge Church building. Okay, so hopefully we can see that these two things are equally true. Okay, and we can transform this type of statement into this one by a rule of logic. So then they would conclude, well, if miracles are not true, and it's the case that if miracles are not true, the Bible's not true, then look at that. The Bible's not true. There you go. Done, they say. Okay. But now, this is valid logic. They follow the rules of logic. But something's a bit weird here, because this one, anyone can see this from reading the Bible, right? This is very obvious. This one just came from transforming this one. But how did they get this one? You might wonder. Well, let's do a sub-argument over here. They would say, okay, if miracles are true, well, then God exists. Well, seems reasonable. Again, I don't think any atheist would, disagree with that. But they say, well, God doesn't exist. And then, again, very similarly, if God doesn't exist, then miracles are not true. And look at that. We concluded, C for conclusion, miracles are not true. And that's what they just plug into that one, you see? So what propositional logic helps us do is to take something someone says and unpack it to see, are they using the rules of logic correctly? Are there any hidden assumptions? In this case, actually, we found one, right? We found a weird hidden assumption. They're assuming miracles are not true because they've assumed that God doesn't exist. Well, that's kind of weird. So really, their argument boils down to, assuming God doesn't exist, the Bible's not true. Well, yeah, I agree with that. If you assume God doesn't exist, the Bible's not true, obviously. But you see, what we took the statement that on its face, you might think, yeah, I don't know how to dispute that. Miracles are sort of impossible. Miracles don't exist. And we've shown actually that this belief is sort of what we call assuming the conclusion, essentially. Assuming God doesn't exist, they've concluded God doesn't exist. Well, this is an error of logic, right? They actually have no logical explanation for why they're making that claim. And just as a bit of a bonus thing here, I'll mention, the reason people say miracles don't exist is they say, well, it breaks the laws of physics. It breaks the laws of physics, they say, right? But actually, it's well supported by the laws of physics, because in any system, so for example, our universe, okay, the sum total of energy and mass in that system is constant. But it's very well understood in science that anyone from outside the system can put in energy, right? Well, that's a miracle then, right? If you have a little jar of your ant's world and you, shine a light on it, heat it up. I mean, to them, that's like a miracle, essentially, right? Energy is being input from outside the system to affect their reality. Well, it's the same thing then, right? That outside our reality is God. He can put in energy and, separate the Red Sea, whatever he wants to do, right? But again, this type of understanding is good science all the way up until you talk about God. And then it's crazy, right? Putting energy in from outside the system is just very well understood science until you talk about God. So again, decision theory is fantastic until you talk about God. Laws of thermodynamics, fantastic until you talk about God. All these things suddenly somehow lose rationality when you talk about God. But of course, right, that doesn't make any sense. Any questions about propositional logic?
You're not saying that that's the only argument about God to miracles, though, right? I mean, people can have opposing arguments to the fact that miracles could be brought on by somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there are ways to explain any individual miracle. But if someone were to say, just broadly, high level, that miracles are impossible, end of story. Well, then you'll say, well, how are you coming to that conclusion logically? And they may say, well, in this one case, it was this. In this one case, yeah, it's fine. But, you said miracles are impossible, period. Well, that's an absolute statement. And an absolute statement then requires an absolute demonstration, right? So, and they're not going to be able to provide that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Okay, one last thing. I think I just said this is the last. I'll do one last one. I think I have it here. Okay, say the rest. Okay. So again, we looked at propositional logic, mathematics, decision theory, scientism and science. Let's look at the legal system. Okay. Because someone may say to you, well, fine, I guess faith is rational, I got math, science, but if you want me to believe in God, prove it. Prove to me that God is true, that God is real. Now, first of all, I don't think we can by Godel's incompleteness theorem. And this would be a very weird thing. Like, if we could if God exists outside our reality, outside our system, and we could prove everything about God using the rules of our system, well, that'd be weird. That's a very weak God, then, isn't it? He exists outside this reality. He created this reality, and yet we can prove everything about him by the rules of this reality. That would be a very weak, strange God. So again, I think if someone tells you to prove God exists, I think we can just say, by Godel's incompleteness theorem, we can't. But put that aside for a second. This just isn't how we approach, again, anything else in society. So think about a court of law. Does someone need to be proven guilty 100%? No, right? They need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And in fact, actually, the case for the objector here is worse, because in a civil trial, it's not even beyond a reasonable doubt. Is it more likely or not? Right? So, and I think this kind of matches our intuition. We should probably believe things that are more likely than not in every case, God and otherwise, okay? And again, we're going to have two classes showing the 10 arguments for the existence of God that show why it's actually very likely, I think, that God does exist. And again, I literally just a second ago went over the best 3 objections I can find, which is, again, evolution, suffering, multiple religions. So we just, in 5 minutes, just kind of debunk those. And if you find others, let me know. But the case for the existence of God is overwhelmingly strong. Okay, so in the idea of a court analogy and the balance of probabilities and which one's more likely true, it seems to me that it's way more likely true that God exists. But in fact, let's think about this a bit differently. There's a Christian lawyer. His name is Abdu Murray. He used to be a Muslim, and he became a Christian, and he's a lawyer. And what he says, look, in a court, okay, if there's a trial, it doesn't always matter. The burden of proof is not always about what happened, but kind of like the circumstances that led to it. Okay, someone is dead. If they were murdered, this is a criminal trial, and the burden of proof is very high, because if you get it wrong, if you have a wrongful conviction, and someone is either sent to jail or in some jurisdiction executed, right? The consequence of getting a wrongful conviction are dire, right? You sent someone to their death or maybe life in prison, okay? So the burden of proof is high because the consequences for a wrongful conviction are high. What about an accidental death? Someone accidentally died, maybe someone is going to be sued for millions of dollars, okay? The burden of proof is lower. Now the burden of proof here is, again, just is it more likely than not? Because in a wrongful judgment, well, someone might be out a few $1 million, still better than being executed. Okay. So the burden of proof is sort of tied to the consequences of a wrongful judgment. Okay. Now, in the court case of sort of belief in God or not, if the Christian is wrong about God and God doesn't exist, what dire harm befalls the skeptic? Nothing, right? We all die, become worm food, that's the end, right? So the burden of proof wouldn't actually be that high, right? And I mean, now, side note, according to Pascal's wager, even if the odds are stacked against us, it's still statistically possible to believe, but whatever, put that aside. Think of the reverse now. If the skeptic is wrong, if the skeptic, the atheist, whatever, convinces a Christian to abandon their faith, what dire consequence will befall the person that believes them? Well, hell, separation from God forever. That's bad, very bad, right? The consequences of a wrongful judgment are as high as they can be. Literally, according to Pascal's wager, negative infinite. So the burden of proof for the skeptic is through the roof, right? So if anyone should be proving something, it should be the skeptic proving to us, not us proving to them. Because if they're wrong, bad things happen. If we're wrong, we just gathered and gave to charity and sang some songs. Like nothing really bad happened. See? So again, the idea that someone should say, well, fine, faith is rational, but you better prove it to me. First of all, Godel's incompleteness theorem, we probably can't. Second of all, well, we have 10 arguments. So, how many does the skeptic have? I haven't found any. Okay. Number 3, their burden of proof is high, not ours. Okay. So again, I actually, maybe saw, Margaret was walking back and forth through here. She attended the class last time, right? So she works in the healthcare system. And what she said to me was, they use Pascal's wager. Well, not Pascal, but like that idea of like decision theory and stuff in the healthcare system to help people understand their, surgery options and things like that. Like, here's your outcome. Here's the chance of it happening. Okay. So again, just underscoring that all the stuff we went over tonight, like this is real, practical, everyday stuff, right? Whether you look at it through a court of law or the healthcare system, or I say, computer scientists making AI, making other games in my case, or just any kind of, AI, self-driving cars, self-driving cars, got to make a decision. Am I going to, run over this person or that person, okay? Or whatever, right? They have to analyze outcomes. So again, it's, it's real. Healthcare system, legal system, math, computer science, logic. Every way we look at this thing, it's coming back to faith is rational. So if someone says to you, faith is not rational, faith is irrational, they're going to have to explain why they then still believe in all these things, right? Which are the tools we use to show the rationality of faith. Well, we better finish up here because it's about time for the church service. So thank you so much for coming. I've been talking about this forever. So it's just great to have people want to hear it. So I said, I'll send out the video link in case you want to have a refresher or, but yeah, really looking forward to next week looking at the first half of the arguments for the existence of God, which I think are pretty exciting stuff. So let me pray and we can finish up. And dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much, God, for giving us minds to pursue you, God. You give us hearts to love you, to be in that relationship with you, and minds to adore you, to worship you, to pursue you, to follow you, to find you. And I thank you so much, God, that that when we search you, God, Jesus says, we will find you, God, and we'll find not just an intellectual answer, we will find you, your son, Jesus, the savior of the world, that brings us into relationship with you, God. And so I thank you that this is not just an intellectual pursuit, God, but this is ultimately in service of finding true life, God, in you, in your son, and that these things really come together in just the most amazing way. So we thank you so much, God, for this class, this ability for us to understand you. And I just pray for every person here, Lord, that this really would be a benefit to them in their own, sort of personal faith, and that you would inspire them by the Holy Spirit to anyone that they may come into contact with that could benefit from this as well, God. So we thank you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thank you so much. Hope that was beneficial for you, and looking forward to seeing you again next week. One thing, Dana said, if you leave your workbooks here, she can put notes in them or something. I'm not quite sure exactly what she meant by that, actually, now I think of it, but that was her recommendation. Leave your notebooks here. I guess put your name on it. And then we'll be here for you next time, and she can do something, whatever she's planning to do, she can do.